Northern Europe's oldest cities, a place steeped in history, where ancient stones and antique structures, the bones of the city's past, breathe an air of quiet, timeless charm, whose narrow streets beguile the bystander's eye above the shop fronts to see reminders of bygone times still fixed to a rich mix of buildings in a vast range of architectural styles. We want to show you this deeply fascinating place, and then, beyond these lovely relics of the city's romantic past, to tell you the story of its 2,000-year history. It was the arrival of the conquering legions of Rome which began the city's history. Although our knowledge is uncertain, it is highly possible that Petilius Cerialis, governor of Britain and a veteran of Boadicea's revolt, saw that the neck of land between the River Ouse and the River Foss was a perfect site for a Roman fortress, easily defended and covering the only crossing of the Ouse in the last 90 miles of the river's course. York became the anchor of the defences of Imperial Rome's northwest frontier, the most northerly bastion of Roman civilization. The stone-walled garrison fortress on one side of the River Ouse was joined by a bridge to a civilian town, a settlement for traders, retired legionaries, and the camp followers who are always to be found around garrisons. The Romans called the city Eboracum, and its stone walls protected a prosperous town with mosaic pavements, good drains, and the luxuries of Roman culture. Occasionally, there was trouble on the frontier, and a particularly serious revolt may have wiped out the 9th Legion within 60 years of the founding of the city. The Emperor Hadrian came here to deal with it, and built Hadrian's Wall to the north to make sure it couldn't happen again. York's fortress housed a new legion, the 6th. The centuries passed, and emperors came and went in distant Rome, occasionally arriving in York with armies on campaign. Tough old Septimius Severus, who died here in 211 AD, and Constantius Chlorus, who also died here in 306. His son, Constantine, was proclaimed emperor by his troops here, touching off a bloody civil war which engulfed the Roman Empire. The end result was that Constantine became emperor and proclaimed Christianity as the state religion of Rome, thereby ensuring that Christianity became the most important religion in medieval Europe. This was an epoch-making step for European civilization. Fragments of Roman Eboracum, some from Constantine's time, evoke its imperial past. The multangular tower was commissioned by Constantine's father, Constantius Chlorus, to strengthen the fortress against the menace of Saxon pirates. Now roofless, its small, neat Roman masonry with brick strengthening bands is typical of late imperial work. The Roman bath is even older, from about 150 AD. It was found under a city centre pub, and here legionaries steamed out the aches and pains of a hard day's marching in full armour. The restored Roman pillar is now set up opposite the minster. It came from the Roman headquarters building, or Principia, which was right under where the minster now stands. This pillar's stones probably witnessed the dramatic raising of the young Constantine to the imperial purple in 306. Today, archaeologists are uncovering more of the secrets of Eboracum, laying bare streets and buildings buried for centuries. Smaller articles created by long-dead craftsmen give a hint of the people of that long-ago imperial city on Rome's northwest frontier. Between 400 and 600 AD, records are sparse. The Roman Empire shrank, while Angles and Saxons pushed across the North Sea and up the rivers in pirate boats. They settled, setting up 7 kingdoms, one of which, Northumbria, controlled York. The remains of their town, called Eophowic, were found in 1986, outside the Roman defences, at the junction of the River Ouse and the River Foss. Our picture of Anglian York is still vague, and only one structure from the period survives above ground, the Anglian Tower, close to the Roman Multangular Tower. Beside it, archaeologists have cut away the bank of the city walls to reveal the many layers of building and rebuilding which have gone on over the centuries. After 800, Scandinavian Vikings, raiding across the North Sea, conquered the Kingdom of Northumbria. For 2 generations after 874, Vikings ruled in York, or Jorvik as they called it. Here in York, we have a unique window into their culture and lifestyle of 1,000 years ago. In the late 1970s, archaeologists digging on the site for this new shopping centre in Coppergate found one of the most important Viking sites ever, with materials superbly preserved in the waterlogged ground. Careful redesign of the new shopping centre resulted in the preservation of the site as the heart of the Jorvik Viking Centre, a wonderful museum which recreates Viking life as it was lived on the site 1,000 years ago. It is complete with the sounds, smells and everyday sights of long-ago Jorvik. Viking York was prosperous, thriving and very smelly. It was the biggest city in England after London, crowded with traders and craftsmen, and the Jorvik Viking Centre brings this long-lost incarnation of York vividly to life. But prosperous Anglo-Scandinavian York was in for a big shock. In 1066, England was threatened by twin invasions, one from Norway, led by King Harald Hardrada, and another from Normandy, led by Duke William. The saintly King Edward the Confessor had died in London childless, and his successor, chosen by the English nobles, was Harold Godwinson. William of Normandy, Edward's nephew, claimed the throne, and Harold Godwinson's brother Tostig, a former Earl of Northumbria exiled for his violence, had persuaded the Norwegians to invade northern England. Hardrada got here first, destroying Scarborough on the way, and then defeating the northern English army under the Earls Edwin and Morcar at Fulford just outside York. York was about to surrender to the invading Norwegians, but help was at hand. Harold Godwinson, moving his army north at the then incredible rate of 20 miles a day, surprised Harold Hardrada at Stamford Bridge. By nightfall, the Norwegian army was nearly wiped out. Hardrada, a conqueror from the Baltic to the eastern Mediterranean, was dead with an arrow in his throat. Harold Godwinson's faithless brother, Earl Tostig, was dead too. A great victory feast was held the day after in York, but the celebrations were short-lived. At the feast, Harold Godwinson received the news that William had landed on the south coast. His army hurried south and paid the price for its victory at Stamford Bridge on the bloody field of Hastings. Harold was killed and his army destroyed, and Duke William, now King William the Conqueror, ruled England. William and his land-hungry Norman followers were resented. In York, William had taken land and demolished houses to build 2 castles, one on each side of the river approaches. In 1069 and 1071, York rebelled, and York's Norman castles were stormed and burnt, their garrisons massacred. It was the most serious rebellion William the Conqueror ever had to face. His vengeance was pitiless. York was besieged and stormed, and the north lay helpless under the iron heel of his anger. York was burnt, and its Saxon minster destroyed. Half the population was massacred, and the process was repeated throughout Yorkshire. The new rulers were alien, stern and unforgiving, but they were efficient, and under the Normans and their successors, the French Plantagenets, medieval York was to reach a peak of prosperity and greatness. The York we see, filled with ancient buildings and streets, took shape under the Normans. They built a great new minster, and the rich new abbey of St. Mary's was founded on the site of the palace of the Earls of Northumbria at Galmanhoe, close by St. Olaf's Church. The Hospital of St. Leonard's, by far the largest in northern England, was begun, close by. 2 castles were set out, one on each side of the river. One was only short-lived, but its mound survives as the old Bale. The other is still with us, its mound crowned in stone by Clifford's Tower. The great circuit of city walls took on its current plan, though the full girdle of stone walls took centuries to complete. All over the city, still the second biggest in the country, ambitious new projects took shape, and in the 2 centuries before 1350, medieval York flourished. It was a prosperous city with a flourishing foreign trade, and ships unloaded at King's Staith, or Wharf, by the side of the Ouse. Ouse Bridge was then the only bridge across the Ouse. The medieval bridge was a bit like a small-scale version of Old London Bridge, with buildings on it. York's other 2 bridges are 19th century. This is Skeldergate Bridge, with a fanciful gatehouse built in the late 19th century by a private company, but later taken over by York City Council. York's other bridge, Lendal Bridge, was built by the North Eastern Railway Company in the late 19th century to provide access to the railway station. In medieval York, 3 kinds of law held sway: the cities, the kings in the area of the castle, and the church's law, shown on this map in green. Wrongdoers could and would flee from one area of the city to another to avoid being arrested. The Minster had its own prison, and also a complete section of the city was walled off and called St. Peter's Liberty. St. Mary's Abbey also had its own private walled enclosure. The friaries and religious houses were also separate from the city, whose authority was exercised here at the Guildhall by the Lord Mayor and Aldermen, a small, powerful group of rich merchants. Let's look more closely at some of the buildings medieval York has left behind for us. York Minster is the pride of the city, the biggest Gothic cathedral north of the Alps. Of the late 11th century Norman minster erected after the warfare and bloodshed of the 1070s, nothing remains above ground. The transepts are the oldest part now standing. They're built in a stark, severe, early Gothic style, with very little decoration except the black marble shafts, which emphasize the vertical lines of their structure. The octagonal chapter house, built between 1260 and 1285, is unique in having no central pillar. The rebuilding of the East End led to the rebuilding of the central tower, which nearly collapsed in 1407, and the building as we see it was finished when the tops of the west towers were finished in the 1480s. Apart from the Minster, the most important religious building in York was St. Mary's Abbey, founded in the late 11th century and for nearly 500 years the wealthiest monastery in northern England. Now a ruin set in museum gardens, it forms the backdrop to the York Mystery Plays every 4 years. The ruins of its great church date from about the same period as the chapter house of York Minster. The Abbey had a chapter house too, now located beneath the Yorkshire Museum, where its remains are preserved, including these beautiful column statues of prophets and saints, which once supported its roof. The gatehouse of St. Mary's still stands, but originally the buildings were huge and extensive. The abbot's house, rebuilt in the fashionable new material of brick in the 1480s, 60 years before the abbey was dissolved by Henry VIII, was luxurious enough to be taken over by the king for his own use. Now called King's Manor, it was a royal residence every once in a while, but mostly served as the headquarters for the Council of the North. This much-feared organisation ran the North for the Crown for over a century, headed by such men as the notorious Earl of Strafford, Black Tom Tyrant. His rule of the North, for Charles I, was one of the causes of the Civil War, and Parliament voted his death in 1641. Only battered fragments remain of St. Leonard's Hospital, close to St. Mary's Abbey, and once the biggest hospital in the north of England. The ruins include this lovely vaulted undercroft. York Castle also only has fragmentary medieval remains. Clifford's Tower, once the central strong point of the castle, still stands atop its mound. York Castle was much rebuilt in the 18th century and became a prison and law courts. The courts are still there, but the prison, whose condemned cell included among its past occupants Dick Turpin the highwayman, is now a museum.
And what a museum! York's Castle Museum is one of the finest folk museums in the country, home of an unrivalled collection of bygones. The museum was started by Dr. John Kirk, who had a private collection. His collection was built up as he went on his rounds in the 1920s and 30s and realized that whole areas of everyday life were no longer being recorded. He gave his collection to the city in 1938 and it now forms the nucleus of York's Castle Museum.
Much added to since, it is superbly exhibited here. Inside the Castle Museums are whole rooms as they were in olden times, craft workshops, even a whole street of Victorian buildings, lovingly reassembled with shops of all kinds. Everything is recreated in loving detail. The sweet shop, seen here, still has the familiar sugary smell of an old-fashioned corner shop. Returning in time to the buildings of medieval York, the city's civic and trading past can be seen in the medieval guild halls. The City Guild Hall by the banks of the Ouse is still the meeting place of the City Council. Rebuilt after bomb damage in World War II, it's been the centre of city government for 500 years. The city's medieval guild halls testify to the wealth, power and confidence of the city community. The Merchant Venturers Hall, with its half-timbered upper hall and stone undercroft, is the finest of all, located by the River Foss. York's medieval parish churches, though not as grand as the Minster, are also full of beauty, charm and interest. The Church of All Saints North Street, with its chancel roof filled with angel musicians, is one of the loveliest. It's worth remembering that the marvellous stained glass windows of this church would have been normal equipment for a church in the Middle Ages. Each window tells a story. Here we have the Acts of Mercy, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, giving alms, and visiting prisoners, with the same little figure of a rich merchant with a beard who probably gave the window, doing all the good deeds. No false modesty here. Look at this lovely St. Anne teaching the Virgin Mary to read, and this St. Christopher, calm and thoughtful under his burden, as his staff miraculously sprouts leaves. York's churches often form oases of quiet and peace just off busy shopping streets in the middle of the city. Here is Holy Trinity Gudrumgate, with its peaceful little churchyard hidden behind buildings right in the middle of York. Its interior still contains old-fashioned box pews, just as it did 200 years ago, when pews were rented by God-fearing citizens who made sure that their families and apprentices went to church regularly. Other York churches include All Saints' Pavement with its splendid lantern tower in which a light was hung for lost travellers, and Holy Trinity Micklegate, once a much bigger church, whose blocked-up arcade shows how it has shrunk since the days when it was a monastery. Last but not least, St. Michael the Belfry, under the shadow of the Minster, the last city church to be rebuilt before the Reformation. It has fine stained glass, including this picture of St. Hugh of Lincoln with his pet swan. Late medieval York, from 1350 onwards, was a city in crisis. Medieval York wasn't all wonderful. It was dirty and plague-ridden. The Black Death killed 1 in 3 of the city's population in 1349. Imagine streets like the lovely Shambles, once the Street of the Butchers, unpaved, undrained, with slops slung out of the upper windows, flies buzzing over the food in the shops, and rats swarming to scavenge the waste. Medieval cities were pretty unhealthy. York's oldest streets date from late medieval times. Houses like Mulberry Hall in Stonegate date from the 15th century in their basic structure, as does much of the shambles. Often these timber-framed houses still show carved details, such as this window in St William's College, close to the Minster. It was founded in the second half of the 15th century to be the home of priests serving in the Minster, and is now a wonderfully historic place to eat a light meal or take tea.
Later in the same century, King Richard III, another friend to York who knew the city well, was defeated and killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. The city council records read that he was most piteously slain and murdered. The city remained disaffected from the new dynasty, the Tudors, for a long time. Starved of royal support and patronage, the city declined economically in relation to southern towns such as Norwich and Bristol. In religion, too, the city was out of step, clinging to Catholicism against the trend of the new government's Anglican religious settlements of the 16th century. Evidence for this can be seen in the rebellion of the Northern Earls in 1569.
It's no surprise to find that Guy Fawkes, who tried to alter both government and religion by gunpowder treason and plot, was born in York. By the 17th century, with the Tudors gone and replaced by the Scottish Stuarts, royal government was becoming unpopular. Stern royal officials like Strafford, of the Council of the North, were high-handed and resented. As discontent grew and government came under heavier pressure, Strafford was executed by parliamentary vote on Tower Hill in London. Eventually, the strains between King Charles I and his Parliament grew to open war, with Parliament's forces, the Roundheads, battling against King Charles's Cavaliers. The king was staying in York at the outbreak of the war in 1642, and York became the main northern stronghold of his power. The 2-mile circuit of walls was manned and defended. The great gates, Micklegate Bar, Bootham Bar, Monk Bar, and Warmgate Bar, were manned with musketeers, and a garrison of 8,000 men faced attack from parliamentarian armies converging on the city. The siege dragged on for month after month, with Roundhead cannon batteries bombarding the city walls. The city held out grimly until a royalist relief army under the king's most dashing commander, Prince Rupert, slipped across the Pennines and raised the siege. Prince Rupert decided to grab his opportunity to smash the parliamentarians completely, advancing out of York to attack the Roundheads at Marston Moor.
On the 2nd of July 1644, he found out the hard way that warfare is a chancy business, being disastrously defeated, largely owing to the efforts of an East Anglian general called Oliver Cromwell, whose steady cavalrymen defeated one royalist wing and then rallied to smash the other. Rupert fled, a fugitive, and the rags of his army straggled back through Micklegate Bar. Micklegate was packed with exhausted, demoralized, grimy, powder-stained men, many of them desperately wounded, and it was only a matter of time before the city surrendered. 10 days later, York belonged to the Parliament.
Luckily for the city, and for us, the overall parliamentarian commander, Fairfax, was a Yorkshireman with estates in the city, as was his son, Thomas, Cromwell's commander. York was spared the terrors of a sack, and the Roundhead troops were forbidden to damage the city, its churches, or Minster in any way. York had got off lightly, and was never to face armed attack again. The walls have stood quiet ever since the mid-18th century. They were last garrisoned in the scare over Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745. They have turned from a stern defence work into a charming walker's route for getting around the city out of the traffic, and for viewing its many sights. Nearly demolished completely in the 1820s to make way for a ring road, today they form England's finest and most complete set of city walls, alive with daffodils in springtime. Energetic visitors may notice that there is a gap of some 400 yards between Red Tower and Layerthorpe Postern. This has actually always been there, for in the Middle Ages the foss was dammed at Castle Mills to fill the castle moats, and flooded the low-lying land behind to form the large King's Pool on the right-hand side of this map. 18th century York, though still within its walls, was an increasingly refined town, with restrained, well-proportioned Georgian houses and other buildings of a more public nature, such as the Assembly Rooms, which was an early design by the great Palladian architect, Lord Burlington. Here were held balls, concerts and recitals for the pleasure and delight of the local upper crust, such as the Fairfaxes, whose town house near the castle, Fairfax House, is now a lovingly restored glimpse of 18th century gracious living. Its rooms are decorated painstakingly to original patterns and furnished with furniture and works of art of the period. York was soon to change more in a few years than ever before. Since the Middle Ages, its population had not grown vastly, and in 1800 there was still not much building outside the walls. Although York does not immediately spring to mind when the Industrial Revolution is mentioned, one aspect of industrialization was to crucially affect York. Railways. Britain's greatest promoter of railways, the apostle of a new age of transport, the Railway King, was a York man, George Hudson, who started up in business as a draper here in what is now the National Trust shop near the Minster on Goodramgate. Today he has a street named after him and even a pub. George Hudson's drive and megalomania made York one of the main railway centres of Britain, headquarters of the Great North Eastern Railway Company, with an enormous, beautiful railway station which was the biggest in the world when built. It's a masterpiece of Victorian cast-iron construction, built on a curve with a beautiful curving roof. It's fitting that York is now the home of the National Railway Museum, with its collection of locomotives, rolling stock and other items of railway history. The great steam locomotives of the past are the most spectacular exhibits, such as this broad-gauge replica. It's the great days of steam that the National Railway Museum chiefly celebrates, and on its walls are the nameplates of long-gone locomotives, strong names that fit the romance of the old railways. York's present is happening around us, and most York people, though aware of their city's past, are not obsessed by it. The city of York has warm, friendly pubs, good restaurants, even night spots for those so inclined. But the many visitors who come here come to see its beauty and its past. These two things, beauty and the past, are closely connected, and between them make York a magical place to visit, as well as a fine place to live. York's people are proud of their city, and justly so. Important for hundreds of years, York is now world famous. Its wealth of history, its charm, and its welcoming atmosphere combine to make it unforgettable.